Dean Martin was lining up a quiet putt under the Palm Springs sun when history reached out and interrupted him. Not with sirens or headlines, but with a phone call so unusual it felt wrong before a word was spoken. Because Frank Sinatra never called during Dean's golf games. Never. And yet there it was, urgent enough that a shaken caddy broke golf's sacred rule and ran across the green. And when Dean lifted the receiver in the clubhouse, Frank didn't waste time. He didn't soften it. He went straight to the point. The Kennedy family wanted music after the funeral. Not spectacle, not showbiz, just the voices the president loved. The voices that had helped sell hope to a generation. And every singer in America would have traded their career for that honor. But Dean didn't hesitate. He didn't negotiate. He didn't sigh. He simply said no, a word so final it stunned Frank into silence. And when Frank pressed him, demanded a reason, Dean gave the most dangerous answer of all. None. Because he couldn't. Because the truth was a live wire that would have electrocuted everyone it touched. And the moment he hung up the phone, Dean Martin became something unrecognizable in Hollywood. Not the king of cool, but the man who refused a dead president. And by nightfall, whispers turned into headlines, whispers into accusations, and grief needed a villain, so it chose Dean, the man who went on stage the night Kennedy died and told jokes to a half-empty room, never mentioning the tragedy once, packing up afterward and driving into the dark without explanation, while the rest of America mourned publicly and judged him loudly, never knowing that 3 years earlier, a terrified 23-year-old woman had sat across from Dean in a dressing room, 8 months pregnant, hunted by men in suits who promised she would disappear if she spoke, whispering that the father of her child was Senator John F. Kennedy. And Dean, who had seen enough of power to know when fear was real, chose in that moment to step between a woman and the machinery of history, moving her, protecting her, paying for her safety with his own money and his own silence, threatening forces far more powerful than himself with exposure. He prayed he would never have to unleash, binding that woman to a promise of anonymity so her child could grow up unknown and unhunted. And when Kennedy was assassinated and the nation demanded ritual and reverence, Dean couldn't bring himself to sing praises for a man whose secret child he had hidden, couldn't stand beside a grieving widow while knowing another innocent life existed in the shadows. So he chose to be hated, to be called un-American, to lose bookings, friendships, millions of dollars, to watch even Sammy Davis Jr. and Frank Sinatra turn away from him in confusion and anger, because protecting one quiet life mattered more than repairing his public image. And when an anonymous note arrived thanking him for doing the right thing, Dean burned it because heroes like him don't collect proof. They collect consequences, and they live with them, quietly for decades, while the world keeps guessing wrong, until years later when historians piece together fragments too late to hurt anyone. And suddenly the refusal made sense. The silence made sense. The sacrifice made sense, revealing that Dean Martin didn't refuse to sing because he lacked compassion, but because he had too much of it, enough to absorb the hatred of millions so a woman and her child could live in peace, enough to understand that sometimes loyalty isn't loud, courage isn't celebrated, and doing the right thing means letting history misunderstand you forever. And that misunderstanding followed Dean Martin like a shadow for the rest of his life, quiet but permanent, because even after the outrage faded and the bookings slowly returned, something had shifted in the way people looked at him, as if a hairline crack had formed in the image of effortless charm, and Dean felt it even when no one said it out loud, felt it in the pauses before conversations, in the invitations that never came, in the way some rooms went colder when he entered. Yet he never once tried to warm them with the truth, because the truth wasn't his to spend. It belonged to a woman who wanted nothing more than obscurity and a child who deserved a life untouched by power and scandal. And Dean understood something most people never do, that silence can be an act of love just as loud as sacrifice. Maybe louder, because it demands endurance. And endurance was something he had learned long before fame, long before applause, back when survival meant taking hits without flinching. Frank Sinatra eventually came back, friendship stitched together but never seamless. And even when Frank spoke of loyalty years later, hinting at secrets too heavy to share, Dean only smiled that half smile of his, the one that suggested he knew something the rest of the world didn't, and he was fine with that imbalance. Because some scales aren't meant to be even. In Tucson, a boy grew up playing in the sun, going to school, dreaming small dreams instead of being crushed by a monumental truth, and every anonymous envelope that arrived on time was another quiet victory. Another confirmation that the choice Dean made on that golf course had been the right one, no matter the cost. When Patricia died young, her final letter didn't ask for forgiveness or recognition. It offered gratitude, and Dean kept it hidden away like a sacred object. Never shared, never quoted, because even gratitude could feel like exposure, and he wasn't willing to risk that, not even at the end. By the time historians circled back decades later, armed with records and theories, the damage had already been absorbed by the only man who had agreed to carry it, and those who truly knew Dean read between the lines and finally understood that the man who sang about love and heartbreak had lived one of the loneliest moral decisions imaginable, choosing to be condemned so others could be spared, choosing to let the story remember him wrongly because correcting it would wound people who never asked to be part of history. Dean Martin didn't believe goodness needed witnesses, he believed it needed resolve, and that belief guided him more faithfully than applause ever could. So when people still ask why he refused to sing at JFK's funeral, why he seemed indifferent when the nation cried, the answer isn't buried in politics or ego or spite. It lives in a promise made in a closed dressing room, in a frightened voice asking for help, in a man who understood that sometimes the most patriotic act isn't standing in front of a flag and singing, but standing alone, taking the blame, and letting the music fall silent so someone else can live their life in peace, unseen, unmarked, and free. And that misunderstanding followed Dean for the rest of his life like a quiet shadow, never fully leaving no matter how many hit records he made or how many sold-out rooms laughed at his jokes. Because some choices rewrite how you're seen forever, and Dean accepted that price the moment he said no into that phone, choosing anonymity for others over redemption for himself, carrying a secret heavier than any applause, knowing that history rewards spectacle but rarely recognizes restraint, that it celebrates noise and overlooks silence, even when silence saves lives. And in the years that followed, he never once slipped, never drank too much and talked, never hinted, never defended himself, because a promise made in fear is still a promise. And the safety of a child mattered more than clearing his own name. So when Frank eventually forgave him without understanding, when Hollywood slowly reopened its doors but never quite the same way, Dean didn't push, didn't explain, didn't correct the record. He simply kept going, sending checks anonymously, reading unsigned Christmas cards, watching from a distance as a boy grew up free of cameras and questions. And when death finally came for everyone involved, only then did the truth surface, not as scandal but as context, not as gossip but as revelation, showing that Dean Martin's greatest performance wasn't on a stage or a screen, but in, and that choice followed Dean for the rest of his life, not as a badge of honor, but as a quiet weight he never set down, a knowledge carried alone through packed showrooms and empty moments, through applause that sounded thinner and friendships that never fully healed, because the hardest promises are the ones you can never explain, the ones that cost you misunderstanding instead of praise. And yet Dean never broke it, never hinted, never slipped, even when the truth could have redeemed him instantly. Because redemption wasn't the point, protection was. And that's the part history struggles to measure: the unseen lives spared, the scandals that never erupted, the child who grew up ordinary instead of hunted, the widow who mourned without another wound. And so Dean Martin lived with being wrong in the public record and right in his own conscience, understanding something most people never do, That integrity isn't proven by what you say when the world is listening, but by what you keep silent when speaking would save you. And that sometimes the greatest act of love is choosing to be misunderstood forever. Restraint in choosing to absorb blame, so others could live unburdened, reminding us that real character isn't measured by applause or approval, but by what you protect when no one is watching, and that sometimes the most heroic thing a person can do is accept being misunderstood forever, so someone else never has to be.